court, Willie Jane.
Well, there you are, after 49 days of proceedings in this trial, 7.5 months. Oscar Pistorius, just in the last few minutes, sentenced to 5 years in prison for the culpable homicide in the killing of Reeva Steenkamp. 3 years suspended sentence for a shooting incident, a lesser charge, unlawful discharge of a firearm in a restaurant. 5 years imprisonment for Oscar Pistorius. Very little reaction from the accused. He simply sat down. The Pistorius family saying nothing at all. But let's just find out the details of what exactly Judge Masipa said, because there are some specific elements to that. Professor SS Terblanche, sentencing expert here in South Africa from the University of South Africa. Professor Terblanche, you were actually mentioned there by Judge Masipa, quoting from your book. What exactly did she say about this sentence? Does it mean that Oscar Pistorius must serve 1/6 of this sentence before he's eligible?
Yes, the imprisonment she imposed is specifically provided for in the Criminal Procedure Act, and that, when you read that in complete with a few other articles of the Act, it reads that he has to serve at least 1/6 of that sentence before he can then be considered for release on correctional supervision. Now, correctional supervision is the kind of sentence that the defense went for, which involves house detention, community service and so on. So after having served 1/6 of the sentence, he can then be considered for release on correctional supervision, which in South Africa is very similar to parole, and that will then last until the end of the 5-year period.
So potentially Oscar Pistorius could be going to jail for approximately 9 to 10 months.
He could not be considered for release before 10 months because of the correctional services legislation. Then there's no guarantee, of course, that he will be released, and there will be some processes, so he's unlikely to be released exactly after 10 months if the sentence goes through, of course.
Now, the other lesser charge that Judge Masipa has been considering was this firearms charge, discharge in Tasha's restaurant, 3 years suspended. How does it work with the other sentence?
Well, a suspended sentence is not put into operation until the conditions are breached. And the condition is basically he should not repeat the offence. So there's really that sentence will so-called hang above his head for the period of suspension.
Are you surprised?
Look, I don't think my personal opinion is of any relevance. What I did pick up from the judgment is that it really was an excellent sentencing judgment. She really took into account everything. There are a few little things that I think that she could be criticized about, but that would be about 2% and 98% really a very good sentencing judgment, taking into account everything. One really cannot criticize her for anything but the few points that I might add.
You've been quoted at various points in this sentencing process. Your book was quoted today by Judge Masipa, effectively saying that there is no perfect one sentence. There are always a range of options.
Correct. You know, how can you say in this case, for example, there is a perfect sentence? No sentence will achieve everything one would like to see. You know, you cannot satisfy the society, everyone in society, because society has such different views in this matter, and the victim's family, they will never feel satisfied by a sentence anyway. So it's a very difficult one. There is no perfect sentence.
I'm going to bring in Jean-Jacques Cornish, journalist here in Pretoria. Jean-Jacques, reaction?
Well, I'm surprised. I actually was not expecting a custodial sentence, frankly. And it's now interesting to see whether the whether the prosecution will appeal the judgment, about which there has been a huge brouhaha. But to have Oscar Pistorius walk out before this time next year, I think would have to satisfy the family at least, although I am told by them that they are not going to accept any custodial sentence. So I don't know what that means. I'm surprised that the last picture we saw from the court was Oscar going down. He's going to be in a truck and being taken to Pretoria Central Prison later today, in just a little while. I didn't expect that to happen. I thought that there would be an appeal straight away, or notice of appeal, and there'd be another application for bail. But, you know, the balance that she spoke about with retribution, with rehabilitation and with deterrence, I think that has been achieved here. And the family needs to understand that, you know, if they open the can of worms, they could find that they have another case or another outcome on their hands. So both sides have to go away and think about it very carefully. Certainly it's less than what Gerinel, the prosecutor, was calling for, but it's a great deal more than the family were hoping for.
Judge Masipa mentioned that need to keep society happy, if you like, but also then not to go overboard in terms of actually breaking an accused and over-punish them.
You know, it's important that we as South Africans, the overwhelming majority of South Africans, 85%, if you believe the polls from social media, wanted Oscar to go away for a long time, i.e. 10 years. Now, it's important to understand that she was passing sentence or giving a passing sentence on a man who has made a terrible mistake, and a negligent, terrible mistake, not a murderer. And in the minds of South Africans, Oscar remains a murderer. So that's the sort of sense that, you know, the public interest had to be served, but not, she didn't have to really serve public opinion. Had she wanted to do that, it would have been a much longer sentence.
Stefan, you're nodding your head.
Yes, I agree with that. She, that's why I say it's really a very good sentencing judgment, and it could be an example for many teachers of sentencing law about what a judgment should look like. This balancing act of what society expects of the court, what she said about, you know, the court shouldn't impose a sentence which would result in society taking law into its own hands. Of course, we don't know where that point will come, and neither do the judges. They would rather err on the side of being cautious. You know, that is perhaps the one thing that I would not have liked to see, a 1961 judgment being quoted as, you know, the current point of view of society as far as deterrence and retribution is concerned. We are quite a few years beyond 1961 already, but it doesn't take away from the fact that when it comes to the seriousness of the crime, which the judge did actually go into a lot of detail about in her assessment of the sentence, that what society's view of the crime has to be taken into account there about how serious the crime is. The judge can't just say, in my view, it's not a serious crime, when it's clear that society does view it as a serious crime.
Judge Masipa said herself that she viewed this as gross negligence, that Oscar Pistorius knew that there was somebody behind that door. She said it was to the top end of the offence of culpable homicide, bordering on murder dolus eventualis. Why then do we see a sentence of only 5 years when it could potentially be 15?
Look, the 15 years is basically, it does say so in legislation that for certain forms of murder there's a minimum sentence of 15 years. But even that is subject to substantial and compelling circumstances. And I think that because of his personal circumstances, she felt that a more severe sentence would not be necessary in this case.
Jean-Jacques, she really took apart that one witness that we've been hearing from controversially through the week, Annette Verheer, the social worker, the probation officer who said South African prisons weren't a fit place for Oscar Pistorius.
Yes, it was interesting. I called it sketchy, or quoted the prosecution as calling it sketchy and slapdash. I don't think she has much of a career left as a witness in cases like this. But it was also interesting that she accepted holus bolus the evidence of the correctional services chief, and he had come here just a day after being roasted in Parliament for the torture that is occurring in prisons and the beatings, excessive beatings. She said that human rights groups would have something to say about it if things went wrong. But his view of human rights group was they were a bunch of troublemakers. So a civil society in this country doesn't play the kind of role that it would like to, and certainly not the role that it plays in many more sophisticated countries. So I don't know if the safeguards she's spoken about in the prison service really hold as good as she likes to believe she's leaning on.
I would agree. That would be one of my small criticisms of the judgment, that she accepted his evidence without considering that he has a vested interest in society having the best view of his department, the one that he's the acting chief of. However, at the same time, you cannot judge, as the judge said, you cannot judge rich people and poor people by different standards. And I don't think that even if the judge could find that prisons are poorly managed, they are horrible places, and I think in many instances they are, but that doesn't mean that Oscar, if his crime was serious enough, should not be sentenced to imprisonment. So I think in the whole, all the elements of this thing given together, that the state of our prisons could not have been a factor that could have swayed the judge one way or the other. So, in other words, it's a point of criticism, but it's an irrelevant point of criticism.
You know, interesting that the prison services have come under fire in this regard. They are certainly overcrowded and all of those things. And the fact that Oscar Pistorius, as a man of means and with a wealthy family, got a different outcome to somebody who had simply been picked up off the street. There's so many things in South African law that people are perplexed about and angry about. We have a Springbok rugby player who fired out of the window, killing his daughter in the belief he was firing at somebody stealing the car. He wasn't even charged. So, I mean, we wonder about those sort of things. We wonder about many times where courts give sentences that are too lenient. And that is why I think South Africans were so much up in arms, to the extent, I mean, there was a gross lack of sensitivity towards Oscar and his family. And people felt that that was okay to be so tough. So I think right now, this prison sentence that will see him serve a period of time and then come out and have to work for society again is probably the fairest outcome we could have hoped for.
Of course, one of the things that I would like to see in a sentence is the whole idea of restorative justice, especially when it comes to a situation like this where the victim's family and the perpetrator and his family are fairly closely connected through the various relationships. And the current sentence does permit that, because when he is released, it might well be that a restorative justice condition is attached to that release. Because the family, although they don't realize it yet, most victims actually need that closure. They need to be able to speak to the offender and to voice their concerns and to hear from the offender that he actually takes responsibility in a one-on-one situation, not in the media or in a court situation. And although they may not realize at the moment, and I'm not saying that they are like every other victim, that in research shows that victims really benefit by that eventually they get the opportunity to address the offender directly. I hope that is still possible in this case.
Professor SS Terblanche, Professor of Law here in South Africa and sentencing expert Jean-Jacques Cornish. For the moment, thank you. Now let's just take you back to a short while ago when Judge Masipa, 7.5 months from the very beginning of this trial back on March the 3rd, finally delivered her sentencing judgment.